I'm going to tell you a story. When a madman offers to tell you a story, you should always listen. Madmen possess all the clarity of genius without any of the inconvenience of politeness or social grace that can so often ruin a tale. Not that I'm mad, nor am I a genius. Maybe somewhere dilute and weathered in between. Not quite water, not quite espresso. So this is a story by a cup of milky instant coffee. Once upon a time, because many stories should start like that, there lived a man called King Furciel. This king was, quite unsurprisingly, the richest man in his kingdom. He had jewels and clothes and gold and banquets and finery people like you and I could only ever dream of, if people like you and I ever saw fit to waste time dreaming of such ephemeral things. If I said the king also had a splendid box of all the most beautiful metaphors in the world, then that should get your interest. And this is what he had. And a cellar of the most perfectly aged wine that stretched for miles, an entire rack as big as a house for any year you could think of, and a library that crossed at least 2 international time zones, with everything ever written by anyone on any subject you could imagine, and in first, second and third edition, naturally. And a kitchen so well stocked and expertly staffed that other countries would send ambassadors to his court to check for the most accurate recipe of their own national dishes. Suffice it to say that in all respects, this was a very wealthy king. But despite it all, this king was very lonely. He never married, and took no mistress nor consort. In fact, many of his servants and ministers thought that the king might be homosexual, but he didn't show much interest in men either. It was not that he was never offered attention by anyone. By a long tradition, which I'll tell you about later, the most beautiful men and women in the land would approach him, flirt with him, but respectfully, for remember, this was a king. But the king never seemed interested in any of these beautiful people, and they were very beautiful. A lot of them were blonde, in fact, with blue eyes like an ocean. Secretly, the king had long since tired of people with blonde hair and blue eyes, because he began to think that most of them were probably agents of some ancient evil. It was not, however, merely beauty that failed to endear the king to any potential mate. The wisest and most learned people in the land would come to him and offer to engage him in philosophical discussion or paint his picture to a quality far superior to any digital camera, of which the king had an entire wing in his palace, or compose for him the most exquisite operas and symphonies. But the king was interested in none of them. Not even the woman who kept coming back with her magical performing existential puppet show. Though she often made him laugh, the king only ever felt all the more lonely after his laughter stopped. You see, the thing is, what none of these people knew, not his subjects, nor his ministers, nor his servants, for the king had been forbidden to tell them, was that he was cursed. When he was once just a lowly woodcutter, living in a bungalow in the forest, long before he'd become king, he'd had the misfortune to encounter a bad fairy. Now this bad fairy was a very wicked fairy indeed. You can always tell a bad fairy because they've disguised themselves as a good fairy, and that's just what this one had done. He appeared before the king, then a woodcutter, in case you hadn't been paying attention, and offered to grant him 2.5 wishes. Now the king, still a woodcutter at that point, was never very good at maths, and because he didn't want to look stupid in front of the fairy by not really understanding how half a wish could work, he heartily agreed to this promise. "I wish," the king had said, "that everyone in the world would stop fighting, and instead live in peace." The bad fairy, still disguised as a good fairy, thought about this for a moment, and then waved his bad fairy wand, which the king had not yet noticed was shaped like something very rude indeed. And suddenly, Furciel found himself king, with all the treasures in the world as his possessions. He was surprised and confused, and looked at the bad fairy hovering quite proudly in mid-air before him. "But this isn't what I wanted," he cried out to the bad fairy. "I didn't want to be rich. I just wanted everyone to stop fighting." "But they have," the bad fairy replied. "You now own all the wealth and riches in the world, and because no one else has any wealth, they no longer want to fight each other. They no longer envy each other because they all have just as much, or as little, of nothing as one another." "But then they will all hate me," the king said. "Yes," said the bad fairy, "but this is the price for the end to fighting that you wanted. There must always be someone to be hated for everyone else to be loved. There must always be someone who is seen as evil for everyone else to see themselves as good." "But I don't want to be hated," the king said. "I'm not evil." "That doesn't matter," the bad fairy scoffed. "You don't have to be evil to be seen as evil." "But what if I give the treasures I have back to the people? Then they will see that I'm good." "But then there will be imbalance in the world again," warned the bad fairy. "Then there will be hate and envy between people once more, and soon the fighting will begin again." "What if I made sure that everyone had equal amounts?" the king asked. The bad fairy asked the king if he had ever heard of the Soviet Union. The king said he hadn't. The bad fairy said he couldn't be bothered to explain the illusion, but to just trust him that it wouldn't work, and that he could not share any of his treasure with the people. "I don't know if I still want there to be no more fighting, if this is what it means for me," the king said. The bad fairy didn't say anything. He just nodded slowly and wore an expression that could easily have been mistaken for sympathy. "It's not very fair," the king continued. "I just wanted to make everyone happy, but it seems I can only do that by suffering myself. What have I done to deserve that?" "All happiness comes at a price," the bad fairy said. "The greater the happiness, the greater the price. Are you sure you want to give this up?" "Well, someone else can do it, can't they?" "Of course," said the bad fairy. "Probably." "Okay then," said the king. "I wish that I didn't make that wish." "Done," said the bad fairy. And it was so. The king became a woodcutter again, and fighting and envy and greed returned to the world. At this point, the bad fairy then politely pointed out that he still had half a wish left. "Is that all?" the king, now a woodcutter, asked. That was all a bit pointless. The fairy just shrugged and asked him if he wanted to make his wish now, as it was almost 5 o'clock and he was due to come off his shift soon. But the king said he wanted to think about this one and to come back in a fortnight, traffic and weather permitting. And so the bad fairy left.